Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Christopher McCandless was born on February 12, 1968, in El Segundo, California. His family was financially well off. His father, Walt McCandless, was a successful engineer working for NASA, and his mother, Billy McCandless, ran her own business. Christopher and his sister Corrine lived an upper-class, privileged life in Virginia. However, Christopher had a deep sense of unease with the lifestyle imposed by his family and society. He grew up as a quiet, bookish child who loved nature. The works of Jack London, Henry David Thoreau, and Leo Tolstoy began to shape his worldview. These authors argued that one could find freedom by disconnecting from modern life and blending with nature. Christopher began to dream of a similar life. However, his relationship with his family was never solid. His parents' constant arguing, especially his father's authoritarian and oppressive nature, pushed Christopher away from family life. Over time, he started rejecting the future his family had envisioned for him. In high school, he was a highly successful student. He had a great interest in athletics, particularly long-distance running. His teachers admired his intelligence, describing him as a forward-thinking and independent-minded person. However, Christopher always felt like a stranger in society and dreamed of escaping it. In 1986, he was accepted into the prestigious Emory University, where he studied history and anthropology. Throughout his university years, he continued questioning the system imposed by society. He delved deeply into thoughts about global hunger, inequality, and how capitalism enslaves people. During his university years, Christopher took a trip to Africa. This experience completely changed his perspective on life. The poverty he witnessed and the suffering of people made him ashamed of all the material things he had as someone from a wealthy family. When he returned, he was fully convinced that material possessions didn't bring happiness. In 1990, on the day of his graduation, when his family offered to buy him a new car, Christopher was pushed to his breaking point. His family expected him to follow the conventional path, get a good job, and have a successful career. But he was determined to do the opposite. He believed that money and status had no real meaning. Shortly after graduating, Christopher made a radical decision. He donated his $24,000 savings to a charity called Oxfam. Then he destroyed his identification cards, credit cards, and social security documents. Officially, there was no more Christopher McCandless. He adopted the name Alexander Supertramp and began his journey of freedom. Without explaining himself to his family or friends, he disappeared. He got into his car and began exploring America. He carried only a few basic supplies and his beloved books in his backpack. He didn't want any of the comforts offered by modern life. He wanted to experience true freedom. He first headed west. He traveled through the Mojave Desert, the Grand Canyon, and the Pacific Coast. During this time, he lived in his car, subsisting on small amounts of food from stores, and stayed at campgrounds. However, after a while, he left his car behind. A flood in California had damaged the car's engine. Rather than fixing it, he abandoned the car and continued on foot. He was now fully immersed in nature. He traveled through many states such as Montana, South Dakota, and Arizona. He chatted with people he met along the way, but always behaved like a traveler. He didn't want to get attached to anyone or anything. This journey was only the beginning, for him. His ultimate goal was to live completely alone in the wilds of Alaska and test his survival skills. However, his romanticized vision of nature had yet to face the harsh realities of the world. Christopher McCandless, or Alexander Supertramp, after abandoning his car in 1990, began traveling across America, walking, hitchhiking, and sneaking onto trains. For him, this was not just a journey, but a quest to discover himself and escape from the chains of modern life. He rejected the comforts offered by the consumer culture and capitalist system, dedicating his life entirely to nature and freedom. After abandoning his car, Christopher McCandless walked towards the California deserts. Despite the harsh conditions, He found peace in being alone with nature. He walked alone in the desert for several days, sleeping under the stars at night, and wrote the following in his journal. People think they are in pursuit of freedom, but in reality they are afraid. True freedom is having the courage to leave everything behind. After his journey in the desert, he headed north and spent some time on the Oregon coast. He worked short-term jobs to earn a bit of money, but since he didn't value money much, he usually either donated his earnings or spent it only on basic necessities. By the end of 1990, he reached South Dakota and began working at a farm owned by a man named Wayne Westerberg. Wayne saw Christopher as a sincere and intelligent young man. Although he wasn't physically strong, Wayne noticed his determination and hard work. For several weeks, Christopher worked in the wheat fields, trying to cope with the heavy labor and meeting new people. Wayne and the other workers at the farm liked Christopher. However, they knew he wouldn't stay in one place for long. He was afraid of becoming tied down and trapped in a routine life. One day, Christopher told Wayne that he wanted to go to Alaska. For him, true freedom could only be achieved by completely distancing himself from people and the modern world. Wayne offered him to stay, even offering him a job and accommodation. But for Christopher, this would mean losing his freedom. Wayne understood his determination but was concerned. Alaska is dangerous. You should make sure you're really ready before going, he said. But Christopher replied that nothing could make him give up on his dream. After some time, he left the farm and set out on his journey again. After leaving South Dakota, Christopher traveled through many states, including Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and Louisiana. Along the way, he hitchhiked and met different people. Truck drivers, travelers, farmers, and hippies helped him. Sometimes he had long conversations with people sharing his thoughts on freedom. But no matter how many good people he met, he made sure not to get attached to anyone. For a while, he lived in Slab City in California. This was a community of people who had left the modern world, living outside of society. Here, he met warm people and like-minded individuals. He spent some time there, but his dream of Alaska grew stronger and stronger. In 1991, Christopher decided he wanted a different adventure and decided to go to Mexico. Since he didn't have identification, he crossed the border illegally and traveled along the Colorado River by canoe. He paddled for days, slept in the wild, and battled hunger. This journey tested his courage. However, things didn't go as expected in Mexico. A few weeks later, he was caught by the authorities and interrogated. Since he had no identification, things became complicated. Fortunately, he was deported back to the U.S. After this incident, he had to live within society for a short time. By the beginning of 1992, he had made a firm decision to go to Alaska. He wanted to survive completely on his own in the wild. He had learned to live in the wild, strengthened his endurance against harsh conditions, and gained many experiences. But he still needed a bit more money for this journey. So, he returned to Wayne Westerberg's farm in South Dakota and worked for a short time again. Wayne and the workers at the farm realized how determined Christopher was. They gave him a rifle, camping gear, and some survival tips. However, Christopher's biggest mistake was not taking a proper map and enough supplies with him. He wanted to get completely lost in nature, believing that over-preparing would ruin the adventure. Finally, in the spring of 1992, he set out on his journey to Alaska. He was determined to completely disconnect from the modern world and live his dream. But nature would be much more unforgiving than he had imagined. In April 1992, Christopher McCandless, Alexander Supertramp, finally stepped onto the land of Alaska that he had dreamed of. This journey was not just an escape for him, but also a journey of freedom and self-discovery. He was running away from the chaos of cities, the false rules imposed by human relationships, and the life defined by money and status. According to his beliefs, true happiness was found in solitude and living in harmony with nature. However, the challenges nature offered would turn out to be much more ruthless than he had imagined. Christopher, with the money he earned from his last job in South Dakota, hitchhiked to Seattle and then toward Alaska. Along the way, he met many people. One of them was an old hunter who took him as far as Fairbanks. When the hunter heard about Christopher's plan to survive alone in the wilderness, he became concerned and advised him to at least bring more food. However, Christopher politely rejected these suggestions. He believed he could manage on his own. To him, being prepared was a luxury that would prevent him from fully surrendering to nature. Finally, on April 25, 1992, he reached Fairbanks. There, he set up camp for a short time, bought a few basic supplies, and before embarking on his final journey into the wilderness, he bought a few books on hunting and survival in the wild from a bookstore. However, he refused to buy a map or a compass. To him, such items were unnecessary tools of the modern world that prevented one from truly surrendering to nature. Christopher crossed the Teclanica River and entered Denali National Park. He spent several days walking there. Along the way, he enjoyed the sight of deer, birds, and the silence of the wilderness. Being in nature felt like true freedom to him. A few days later, he discovered an abandoned bus, the Fairbanks 142. This old bus had once been used as a shelter by miners. With its decayed seats, rusty body, and broken windows, it appeared to be a pile of junk. But to Christopher, this bus represented a refuge in the midst of nature. He settled there and named it the Magic Bus. In the first few weeks, Christopher greatly enjoyed living in the wild. In his journal, he wrote that he felt freer than ever and had finally escaped the chaos of the modern world. He spent his days hunting and gathering plants. He had taken a rifle with him and used it to hunt rabbits, birds, and occasionally small deer. However, he was not a professional hunter. It was difficult for him to shoot larger animals. He didn't know how to preserve the meat of the animals. He hunted so the food quickly spoiled. He also tried to feed himself with plants he gathered from nature. However, he didn't have enough knowledge about plants and struggled to distinguish between edible and poisonous ones. Still, he believed everything was going well and thought he could survive on his own. For Christopher, the first days went exactly as he had dreamed. He woke up to the sound of birds, drank water from the river, gazed at the sky, and enjoyed nature. He felt as though he was living the life described in the books of Jack London and Henry David Thoreau. He often wrote in his journal about the beauty of nature and the peace he found in it. But nature turned out to be much harsher and more unforgiving than his romantic dreams. The temperatures were much colder than he had expected. Finding food became increasingly difficult, and the loneliness started to weigh on him more and more. A few weeks later, Christopher realized that the real struggle for survival was just beginning. As time passed, it became increasingly difficult to find food. The animals he hunted were no longer as plentiful. Although he managed to kill a deer, the meat quickly spoiled because he didn't know how to preserve it, rendering it useless. This was a major blow for him. Catching a deer had shown that he could survive, but he now realized that survival in nature was not just about hunting. If he couldn't preserve the meat, then hunting it was pointless. Moreover, he began to physically weaken. Day by day, he lost weight, his body grew weaker and his energy drained. He tried to find food from the plants and roots around the bus, but at this point, he made a critical mistake. He accidentally ate a poisonous plant. Christopher thought one of the plants he gathered was edible and consumed it, but as the days passed, his body grew weaker. He started vomiting and he was unable to recover. By the time he realized he had been poisoned, it was too late. His immune system began to fail, and his body rapidly deteriorated. Christopher was now in a battle with nature. He had wanted to leave the modern world behind and live freely in nature, but nature was teaching him a hard lesson. For an unprepared person, nature was ruthless, and survival could not be achieved with romantic dreams. He wanted to return to Fairbanks to recover and heal, but when he went back to the point where he had crossed the Teclanica River, he was in for a huge shock. The river, which had been easy to cross in April, was now swollen with spring rains. The water level had risen and the current had become stronger. It was impossible to cross the river now. He was now trapped at the bus. There was no chance of going back. Christopher gradually began to lose hope. His weakening body, the effects of poisoning and hunger made him weaker with each passing day. The last notes he wrote in his journal clearly showed his despair. In his final days, he wrote, "True happiness is only real when shared." He had spent all this time searching for freedom in solitude. But when he was face to face with death, he realized that happiness only gained meaning when shared with others. Time was running out for Christopher McCandless. He had come to the wilds of Alaska in search of freedom, but nature was about to teach him the biggest life lesson. Christopher McCandless, or Alexander Supertramp as he had named himself, felt a great sense of freedom when he first stepped into Alaska. But as the weeks went by, he began to face the harsh realities of nature. Surviving in the wild was far more difficult than his romantic dreams had led him to believe. In the first weeks, he could easily find plenty of game around him. Rabbits, birds, and rodents were enough to provide him with food. But over time, the amount of game began to dwindle. The animals became more cautious, and he struggled to make accurate shots with his rifle. After his failure in hunting, he turned to gathering edible plants from the wild. But there was a big problem. He couldn't identify the plants properly. Some of the plants he had gathered before caused him stomach discomfort and even made him vomit. Slowly, his body began to weaken, and his immune system faltered. In June 1992, Christopher achieved a major success. He managed to hunt a deer. This was an incredible event for him. Finally, he had enough meat to last him for weeks. But the real problem was just beginning. He didn't know how to preserve the meat. Skinned the deer, cut the meat into pieces, and laid it out around the bus. However, the warm weather and insects quickly began to spoil the meat. Christopher didn't know how to smoke or dry the meat. Within a few days, the meat spoiled and became inedible. This event was truly devastating for him. After all his effort, not being able to eat the meat showed him that surviving in the wild wasn't just about hunting. A lack of knowledge and experience was making survival more and more difficult for him. By July, Christopher had started to seriously weaken. His weight was dropping rapidly, and hunger had become unbearable. Where he once could take long walks, now he would tire after just a few steps. His body was starting to give up due to malnutrition. Hunger was affecting him not only physically but mentally as well. The notes he wrote in his journal became more desperate. The excited lines he had once written about nature were replaced by sentences acknowledging his weakness and helplessness. Nature is much harsher than I thought. To survive, it takes more than just courage. Knowledge and experience are also necessary. During this time, he began relying more on the plants he had gathered from nature. But to identify them correctly, he only trusted the book he had with him. Misinterpreting the information in this book would turn out to be a fatal mistake for him. In mid-July, Christopher made a grave error. He accidentally consumed a poisonous plant. He thought he had eaten a plant from his Edible Plants of North America book. However, he didn't realize that the plant he had gathered was actually poisonous. This plant contained toxins that completely broke down a starving body. Soon Christopher began to feel unwell. He experienced stomach cramps, dizziness, and vomiting. He wrote the following note in his journal: "I'm very sick. I don't know what to do. Will I make it through this?" However, his biggest problem, aside from the poisoning, was that he could no longer eat. The poisonous plant had affected his nervous system and disrupted his body's ability to digest food. No matter how much he ate, his body couldn't process it. At this point, Christopher began to search for a way out. He wanted to leave the bus and reconnect with people again. But there was a major obstacle: the Teclanica River. When Christopher first arrived here in April, he had crossed the river easily, but now, with the arrival of summer, the rains and melting snow had caused the river's current to become extremely strong. He tried to cross the river, but the powerful current quickly swept him away. He was almost drowning. Panicking, he turned back and ran toward the bus. There was no way for him to go back now. This was a complete devastation for him. The area around the bus had now become his prison. Hunger, weakness, and loneliness grew heavier with each passing day. By the last week, of July, Christopher was completely exhausted. He no longer had the strength to walk. He spent his days inside the bus, hardly moving at all. The last notes he wrote in his journal reflected his despair. "I'm so weak. I need help. God forgive me." His admiration for nature had been replaced by the harsh reality. Survival was not possible with courage and a passion for freedom, but with knowledge and preparation. By August, Christopher had become almost completely immobile. Due to extreme weight loss and hunger, his body was spent. He crawled into the bus with his weakening body and spent his final days there. Before he died, he wrote one last message. "True happiness is only real when shared." This was an enlightening moment for him. He had seen solitude as freedom for years. But when he realized that true happiness was found in moments shared with others, it was too late. Christopher McCandless, in August of 1992, passed away inside the magic bus. He had sought freedom, but nature had shown him how fragile a person could be when completely alone. The bus had become his final refuge. Christopher McCandless, also known as Alexander Supertramp, had spent months in the wilds of Alaska, but had grown weaker and had to struggle with hunger. Initially, he believed he could live in complete harmony with nature, but he realized he was alone and unprepared. He now understood that to survive, he needed to break away from nature and return to civilization. By the time July arrived, Christopher was more exhausted and weaker than ever. He couldn't hunt. The plants he gathered weren't providing enough nutrition, and he was struggling to walk due to hunger. His journal entries reflected his acceptance that nature was far harsher than he had imagined, and that surviving alone was much more difficult than he thought. He had come here for two reasons: freedom and self-discovery, but now the reality was much different. When freedom combined with solitude, it became a heavy burden. He now had only one thought: to survive and get out of there. During the days he spent in the bus, Christopher began to make plans to return. He repeatedly examined his map and decided to follow the route back to Fairbanks. From there, he could catch a ride back to civilization and start a new life. He gathered all his belongings, put the little remaining food he had into his backpack, and prepared to leave the bus. But he was unaware of the obstacle that lay ahead. When Christopher made his way deeper into Alaska, he had crossed the Teclanica River. But he did not know that during the spring months, the river's waters would rise, and the current would become much stronger. The river, which he had easily crossed in April, had now become a massive obstacle. When he reached the river, he was shocked by what he saw. The water level had risen at least twice as high, and the current was incredibly strong. He first examined the river carefully, looking for a place to cross. But every part of the river was equally dangerous. If he entered the water, he would be swept away by the current and could lose his life. He waited on the side for a while, hoping the water level would drop. But nature did not care about his plans. The Teclanica River, in all its grandeur, blocked Christopher's path. Still, he did not give up. Slowly, he stepped into the water, but the current was incredibly strong, and within a few steps it began to lift his legs off the ground. Panicking, he turned back and made his way to the shore. Crossing the river was impossible. At that moment, Christopher realized the truth. He was now trapped here. He wanted to go back the way he had come, but Teclanica was not letting him pass. He wandered around looking for another crossing point, repeatedly checking his map. However, the map he had was not detailed and didn't offer him many options. He walked upstream and downstream to try to find a place where he could cross. But this effort, which lasted for days, only made him more exhausted and hungry. There was no other way. The only thing he could do was turn back and wait in the bus again. Had Christopher been able to cross the Teclanica, he might have had a chance to survive. But this cruel obstacle from nature had truly turned him into a prisoner. When Christopher returned to the bus, he was completely broken in spirit. There was no chance to go back now. He had to survive here. But now, he could no longer hunt as he once had. His body had become severely weakened, and his muscles had lost their strength. He didn't even have the energy to shoot. The plants he could gather were becoming scarce, Hunger was taking a greater toll on him each day. As the food shortage grew, he began to feel worse and worse. Hunting had failed, the river had risen to trap him, and he had no one to call for help. He wrote these lines in his journal. "This hunger is awful. I want to go back, but it's no longer possible. There's no way out of here." He began moving less and less. His energy was so low that some days he could hardly walk at all. One day, Christopher noticed that some of the plants he had eaten near the bus tasted different. He had accidentally consumed a poisonous species that resembled the plants he had gathered earlier. As the poison spread through his body, he began to suffer from vomiting and stomach pains. He wrote this note in his journal. "I made a mistake. I'm very sick. God help me." But it was too late. Due to the poisoning, his body could no longer digest food. No matter what he ate, his body could not process it. Hunger had reached a point of no return. As Christopher grew weaker, his perspective on life began to change. At first, he had thought that solitude and being alone with nature were freedom. But now, he realized that true happiness was not about being alone, but about sharing it with others. He wrote this sentence in his journal. "True happiness is only real when shared." This was the greatest realization of his life, but by now it was too late. He had made this discovery, but he would not be able to share or tell anyone about it. As August arrived, he began waiting in the bus with one last hope. Maybe someone would find him. Maybe a hunting opportunity would come. But deep down, he knew the inevitable end was approaching. He grew weaker with each passing day, unable to walk. The world on the other side of the river was so close yet so unreachable. Christopher McCandless was trapped in the wilds of Alaska. He had wanted to go back, but nature wouldn't allow him. Death was approaching, step by step. Christopher McCandless was going through the hardest days of his life. Due to the poisoning, his body could no longer digest food, and each bite he took made him weaker. Hunger and illness combined, dragging him closer to death. As the days passed, he could no longer walk. He lay motionless in the bus for long hours, only finding enough strength to write a few lines in his journal. He understood that everything was coming to an end. Christopher was now able to write very little in his journal. The detailed notes he had kept across the pages had turned into only short sentences. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, and he struggled to write even the letters properly. By August 1992, his body had completely worn out, reduced to nothing but skin and bones. He no longer had the strength to eat or even go outside to gather anything. With each passing day, he felt time slowing down. His survival instinct was still strong, but his body was betraying him. Although he tried to sustain himself with plants and fruits, nothing gave him energy anymore as his metabolism had collapsed. He was a man trapped at the edge of life. When Christopher first arrived in Alaska, he believed that being alone was the purest form of freedom. But as he faced death, he began to delve into deep reflections about his life. He realized that solitude wasn't as romantic as he had once thought. Freedom gained its meaning when shared. Without connecting with others, the meaning of life was incomplete. One of the last sentences he wrote in his journal summarized this realization. "True happiness is only real when shared." This had become one of the most important lessons of his life. But after making this discovery, he knew he could no longer survive. Death had become inevitable. Christopher settled into the bus and began waiting for his final moments. He was exhausted, hungry, and frail. In his final days, he wrote the following on the edge of a book he had in his possession. "God bless you. God bless us all." This was one of his last messages. Finally, he took a photo of himself sitting inside the bus. He tried to smile, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion he felt. At 24, he had completed the greatest journey of his life. By the end of August 1992, Christopher McCandless took his last breath. It is believed that he died of starvation after his body had weakened significantly. He spent a total of 112 days trying to survive alone in the wild, but he could neither overcome nature nor his own physical limits. His body was found about 4 weeks after his death, on September 6, 1992, by a group of hunters passing through the area. When the hunters entered the bus, they found the lifeless body of a young man, seemingly asleep. Next to him were his journal, books, and a few belongings. His tragic story quickly spread across the world. After McCandless's death, John Krakauer conducted a detailed investigation into his life and published the book Into the Wild in 1996. The book gained immense popularity and was adapted into a film of the same name, directed by Sean Penn, in 2007. Christopher McCandless's life and death have become symbols of the modern world's longing for nature and freedom. His story is remembered as a journey that is both inspiring and tragic, filled with a powerful lesson. The bus had become a monument visited by people for years. However, due to safety concerns, the Alaska government removed it from its location. In 2020, McCandless had chased a dream. But nature had been merciless toward his romantic ideals. In his search for freedom, he lost his life. And what remained were these words, inspiring others. True happiness is only real when shared.